Hello everyone. Today my topic is about optic nerve and its visual field defects. So let's start with the eye. This is the left eye, this is the right eye, and this is the visual field. And the visual field is divided into two: nasal field and the temporal field. It's called as nasal field because it's near to the nose. So and it's this one is the temporal field because it's on the temporal side. And actually from the visual field the images are inverted and they are actually small on the retina. So it is actually inverted horizontally as well as vertically. For example, the temporal part of the visual field falls on the nasal side of the visual field. Nasal side of the retina, whereas on the nasal visual field actually fall on the temporal side of the eye. Temporal side of the retina. From there, it goes forms the optic nerve. The axons of the ganglion cells form the optic nerve and it goes to the optic chiasm. The nasal fibers actually cross in the optic chiasm, whereas the temporal part don't cross and they just go to that side. So from the optic chiasm, these two fibers form an optic tract. So what optic tract consists of is the temporal fibers from that eye and the nasal fibers from the another eye, and this optic tract goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus. Most of the fibers goes to the lateral geniculate nucleus, whereas some fibers may goes to the pulminar nucleus and Edinger nucleus and also superior colliculus. So the Edinger nucleus is important for the ciliary sphincter muscle. Actually, it innervates the ciliary sphincter muscle through the parasympathetic fibers and it helps in response to the light reaction. In response to the light reaction, it actually makes our eyes to makes our pupils to constrict. That's a function of the Edinger nucleus. So the fibers from the lateral geniculate nucleus then go to the occipital lobe in two ways. We can call these two ways as the Bayram's loop or Mayer's loop. The Bayram's loop actually called superior retinal fibers. It goes to the superior way to the parietal lobe of the brain and then it goes to the occipital lobe superior part. Actually the superior part is called as gyrus cuneus and the another loop is called as Mayer's loop. Actually this loop goes through the temporal lobe and it goes to the inferior occipital lobe, which is called as gyrus lingualis. And actually this gyrus cuneus and the gyrus lingualis is separated by the sulcus calcaneus. So let's talk about the basic terminology of the visual field defects. So amaresis is a blindness which occurs on both the eye. We cannot see on both the eyes. So if there is abolishment of visual field, like we cannot see one part or the whole part of the one eye, we call it as anopsia. Then we have hemianopsia, in which we cannot see half of the visual field, and we also have quadrant anopsia, in which we cannot see one quadrant, that is called as quadrant anopsia. Then we have monocular and binocular. In case of monocular, there is only visual field defect in only one eye, whereas in binocular there is visual field defect in both the eyes. So if it occurs in both eyes, it may be homonymous or heteronymous. If it is a homonymous, for example, this is the eye and this is the left side and this is the right side. So if in both the eyes the right side is damaged, it is homonymous. In a case of heteronemus, here we can see the right side is damaged and here we can see the left side is damaged. So in one eye, if the right is damaged, the other eye is left is damaged, then we call it as heteronemus. It's usually, it means a different, and homonymous means the same. And let's get into the visual field effects. So the first one is anopia or anopsia of the left eye. Actually, it's one eye blindness. So what happens is there is a damage to the optic nerve. So this is the optic nerve, and it consists of the temporal fibers, and the nasal fibers of only one eye. So when the damage occurs here, both these fibers are damaged and we cannot see both the temporal and the nasal optic field. So blindness occurs in one of the area, one of the eye, but this eye is not affected. That is the anopia of the one eye. If it occurs in the left side, we call it left eye, and if it occurs on the right eye, then we call it anopia of the right eye. So next is damage to the optic chiasm. So here is the optic chiasm. Actually, the nasal fibers cross here, whereas the temporal fibers don't cross here. So when there is a tumor or something that compresses the optic chiasm, only the nasal fibers are affected. So when the nasal fibers are affected, this green one, actually we cannot see the temporal side of the visual field when our nasal fibers are affected. So what happens is we cannot see temporal side of both eyes because the nasal fibers is affected. So half of this field will be blind on both the sides. So we will have something like this, in which this side will be blind and this side will be blind. Since both the temporal side of the eye field is not visible, we call it as bitemporal. And since here left side is affected and here right side is affected, we call it as heteronemus. And since only the half of the visual field is affected in one eye, we call it as hemianopsia. Then the other one is called as uh, actually over here there is the internal carotid artery, which comes from the common carotid artery, and sometimes there may be aneurysm of the internal carotid artery. What happens is um, it causes the compression of the temporal fibers. So when the temporal fibers, both sides may be affected or only one side may be affected. If the temporal fibers are affected, the temporal fibers of that eye is affected and the nasal field is not visible. So if it occurs, for example, on both the sides internal carotid aneurysms, both the temporal fibers are affected and the nasal field is not visible. You can see here internal carotid artery aneurysm and the nasal side is not visible. So we call it as binasal heteronemus hemianopsia.